I used to think I was invincible. At 29, I stood on the rooftop of a glass tower in downtown San Francisco, drink in hand, overlooking a city that I believed I had conquered. Our startup had just closed a $50 million funding round. My name was splashed across tech magazines. Investors called me a genius. Strangers at conferences treated me like I was something more than human. I didn't realize it then, but I was standing at the edge of a cliff and I was about to fall. It didn't happen all at once. It started with small things: a co-founder's missed meeting here, an unusual expense report there, a whisper behind closed doors that I brushed off because why would I doubt the people who helped build this empire? But betrayal doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in the smiles of those you trust. I remember the morning the world collapsed. It was a Friday. I walked into the office expecting to finalize a massive partnership with a Fortune 500 company. Instead, I was greeted by two serious men in suits, one from legal, one from finance, who handed me a packet thicker than any contract I'd ever signed. Inside proof that my co-founder, the man I once called my brother, had embezzled millions, falsified reports, and framed me in the process. By the end of the day, every major tech site had the story: Golden Boy falls from grace, startup wonder kid exposed, another Silicon Valley horror story. Overnight, I wasn't a visionary anymore. I was a cautionary tale. The worst part wasn't losing the company. It wasn't even losing the money, the condo, the Tesla, or the dream. It was losing myself. For weeks, I stayed hidden in my apartment, curtains drawn, phone off. I let the shame seep into my bones. I replayed every conversation, every handshake, every smile, searching for the moment I missed the truth. And I hated myself for being so blind. When the eviction notice finally came, part of me felt relieved. At least now I wouldn't have to pretend anymore. There was no reputation left to protect. I packed what little I had into the back of my old Jeep, a battered, rusting thing that barely started without a prayer. And I drove east, away from the city, away from everything that once defined me. No destination, just the open road and the deafening silence of my own mind. 3 days later, I found myself in a tiny town in Vermont, a place so small it barely showed up on Google Maps. It was late January. Snow blanketed the fields like a thick, suffocating silence. The cold bit into my skin the moment I stepped out of the car, and for the first time in months, I felt something real. I found a cabin on the edge of town. It was cheap, barely standing, with creaky floors and a fireplace that smoked more than it warmed. But it was mine. And right now, that was enough. I spent the first night sitting on the wooden floor staring into a dying fire wrapped in a coat I hadn't worn since college. The wind howled against the windows. Every creak of the old house sounded like a warning. It felt like I had stepped into one of those scary stories people tell at bedtime, the kind where the lost soul never finds their way home. But I wasn't scared. Not anymore. I was empty, and maybe in some twisted way that emptiness was what I needed. The next morning, I dug through the few boxes I'd brought and found an old book buried at the bottom. Its leather cover was cracked. The pages smelled like smoke and memories. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, a gift from a college professor who once told me, "Jack, one day you're gonna need this more than you can imagine." I never read it back then. I was too busy chasing things. Money, fame, validation. But now, with nothing left to lose, I cracked it open. The first line I read hit me harder than any headline ever could. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. I sat there for a long time staring at those words. It felt like Marcus was speaking directly to the broken man sitting alone in a freezing cabin, miles away from everything he once knew. In that moment, something stirred deep inside me, something small, almost imperceptible, not hope, not yet, but a possibility. A possibility that maybe I wasn't completely defeated, that maybe my mind, my soul wasn't wrecked beyond repair. Maybe I hadn't lost the kingdom. Maybe I had just been looking for it in the wrong place. That night, I made a vow. No one was coming to save me. No apology from my co-founder, no redemption headline. If I wanted a future, if I wanted peace, if I wanted to stop living like a ghost inside my own skin, I would have to build it. Not out there, not in bank accounts or stock options. Inside my own mind. My mind was the true kingdom, the only citadel that mattered. And starting now, I would begin the long, brutal, beautiful work of rebuilding it, brick by painful brick, stone by steady stone, until the day came when no storm, no betrayal, no failure, no whisper of the world could tear it down again. The first week in Vermont nearly broke me. The cold seeped into my bones. The heater rattled like it was dying. Half the time I could see my own breath inside the cabin. There was no Wi-Fi, no streaming, no noise, just me and 1,000 uninvited memories. Every mistake I ever made replayed on a loop in my head. I remembered the moments I ignored warning signs, the times I chose ambition over loyalty, the way I mistook applause for wisdom. For days I didn't leave the cabin. I barely ate, I barely slept. The silence was unbearable at first. It screamed louder than any headline ever could. And for a while I let it. I sat by the window for hours, staring out at the endless white fields, wondering if I had completely destroyed any chance of becoming the man I once thought I was meant to be. Then something shifted. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic. No lightning bolt, no voice from the heavens. It happened one morning when I found myself rereading that same line from Meditations over and over again. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Power over my mind, not power over what my partner did. Not power over the investors who abandoned me. Not power over the gossip blogs that tore me apart. Power over myself. I realized I had spent most of my life trying to conquer the world, but I had never once tried to conquer my own mind. I had built towers out of ambition, but my foundation was sand. No walls, no defenses, no true center. I had been wide open to every praise, every insult, every fear, every temptation, without a single gatekeeper to guard what entered. And now here I was, nothing left but the rubble of a life I no longer recognized. But rubble can be rebuilt, stone by stone. I decided right then and there that if I was going to survive, if I was going to live a life worth living, I had to become something I had never been before. A guardian of my own mind, a builder of my own citadel. I started small. Each morning before the sun rose over the frozen fields, I sat by the fire with that battered book on my lap. I wrote down a single question on a scrap of paper. What am I allowing into my mind today? At first, the answers were ugly: anger, fear, regret, but I didn't run from them. I faced them, named them, owned them, and slowly, painfully, I began replacing them. Instead of scrolling through old news articles about my downfall, I read pages from Meditations or other books that demanded reflection instead of reaction. Instead of replaying betrayals in my mind like a horror movie on repeat, I forced myself to list things I still had control over, even if it was just getting out of bed or chopping firewood. Instead of letting fear guide my thoughts, I asked myself every hour, does this thought strengthen me or weaken me? If it weakened me, I let it go, even if it clawed at my mind, begging to stay. The cabin itself became a training ground. The rickety old door that froze shut in the mornings, the fire that needed constant tending, the relentless Vermont snowstorms that buried the world in white silence. Each inconvenience became a test, each hardship an opportunity to fortify the citadel. If I could not master my reactions to these small trials, how could I hope to master greater ones? A few weeks in, I established a ritual. Before sunrise, I'd step outside into the snow barefoot for a few seconds, just to feel the shock of the cold, just to remind myself I am alive, I am sovereign. I began treating my mind like sacred ground. Not every thought was welcome, not every fear deserved a seat at the table, and with every small victory, every angry thought dismissed, every bitter memory let go. I laid another stone in the walls of my inner fortress. I wasn't building to impress anyone. There were no investors to pitch, no followers to please. I was building for me, for the man I still believed I could become, even when everything around me screamed otherwise. Of course, there were bad days. Days when the storm outside matched the storm in my chest. Days when doubt whispered that I was wasting my time, that I was broken beyond repair. But on those days, I reminded myself, a citadel isn't built in a day. It's built with sweat, with patience, with the stubborn refusal to let the past dictate the future. One night, after a particularly brutal storm, I stood outside under a sky so clear it hurt to look at. The stars burned above me like ancient fires, cold and distant and eternal. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something shift deep inside, not a roar, not a blaze, just a quiet, steady pulse, a heartbeat of strength. I wasn't healed, I wasn't invincible, but I was no longer crumbling. Brick by brick, the citadel was rising. And for the first time since the fall, I allowed myself the smallest, most dangerous luxury hope. I wish I could tell you that after a few weeks of reflection and rebuilding, life got easier, but it didn't. If anything, the real battle was just beginning. Because once the walls of the citadel started rising, the real enemies, the ones inside me, came out of hiding. It started with the dreams, vivid, brutal dreams, where I'd relive the betrayal, the public collapse, the humiliation. I'd wake up gasping, the freezing air burning my throat, heart hammering against my ribs like a prisoner begging for release. During the day, the memories lurked at the edges of my mind, like hungry wolves. One moment I'd be chopping firewood, feeling almost at peace. The next I'd be back in that boardroom, staring at papers that spelled out my ruin, while people I trusted looked away. Every failure, every mistake I'd ever made lined up like ghosts, whispering the same poisonous words. You're not enough. You'll fail again. What's the point? Some days I fought back hard. Other days, I barely had the strength to stand. There were mornings I didn't want to get out of bed. Nights when I sat by the fire with a bottle in my hand, debating whether to drown the noise for a few blissful hours. But every time I teetered on the edge, I remembered the vow I made to build a citadel that couldn't be shaken by storms, not even the ones I created myself. No one else was coming to save me. This was my siege, mine to win, or mine to lose. About 6 weeks into the Vermont winter, an email came through. It was a miracle the cabin's old router even pulled it in. The subject line was simple, an invitation. It was from an old investor, someone who hadn't abandoned when the headlines turned ugly. He was launching a new venture, a small ethical fintech company helping local businesses stay afloat during economic downturns. He wanted to know if I was interested in coming aboard. No promises, no easy handouts. Just a door cracked open. Waiting, my hands shook as I read the email. An opportunity. A real one, not to chase fame again, not to patch my broken ego, but to build something real. Something that mattered. Still, the fear rushed back like a flood. Was I ready? Could I step back into the world without losing myself again? Could I stand strong this time, or would I crumble at the first sign of pressure? I sat with the email for 3 days. 3 long, grueling days. During that time, the worst parts of me came roaring back louder than ever. The coward, the cynic, the self-saboteur. They circled like vultures, whispering old scary stories about failure, betrayal, humiliation. Stories I knew too well. Stories I almost believed, almost. On the third night, I went outside just before dawn. The snow was knee-deep. The sky was a bruised purple, waiting for the first hints of light. I stood barefoot again, the cold slicing into me, the air sharp and alive. I closed my eyes. I pictured my mind as a great stone fortress. Inside, a fire burned small but steady. Outside, the voices of fear and doubt clawed at the gates, screaming to be let in. And I realized something: they would never stop. Fear, doubt, regret, they would always come. I couldn't silence them. I couldn't destroy them. But I could choose. I could choose who I let through the gates. I could choose what stayed inside the walls of my citadel. And in that brutal, freezing silence, I made another vow. I will not be ruled by fear. I will not trade my mind for comfort. I will answer only to the fire inside me, not the storm outside. I went back inside, turned on the old laptop, and wrote a single line in reply to the email. I'm in. No hesitation, no overthinking, no endless second-guessing. Just a simple act of sovereignty, a line drawn in the snow. A decision made not in fear, but in quiet authority. That night, for the first time in months, I slept without nightmares. It wasn't the deep, blissful sleep of someone who's forgotten pain. It was the heavy-earned sleep of someone who had faced his demons and decided again to keep building, no matter how many times the walls were tested. I knew the real tests were still ahead. I knew there would be setbacks, betrayals, temptations. But I also knew this: every choice I made from here forward was a stone in my citadel. Every decision to stay disciplined, to lead myself, to guard my mind, it would make the fortress stronger. It wasn't about erasing my past. It wasn't about pretending the collapse never happened. It was about building something new, something unshakable on the ashes of what once was. It was about becoming a man who could not be conquered by outside events, only by surrendering his own mind. And I was done surrendering. The siege within wasn't over. Maybe it never would be, but I was no longer a helpless prisoner. I was a guardian now, the keeper of my own kingdom. And from that night on, no storm, no betrayal, no whisper of failure would breach my gates without a fight. Not ever again. Starting over wasn't a dramatic event. It wasn't some grand gesture or a single day when everything changed. It was small, painfully small, a series of almost invisible choices. And those choices, stacked one on top of another, became the new stones in the walls of my citadel. I built a routine from scratch. Every morning I woke up before the sun, brewed a single cup of black coffee, and sat in front of the fire with my journal. I wrote out my intentions for the day. Not a to-do list, but a who do I want to be list. Patient, disciplined, calm, courageous. Not every day lived up to the standard, but every day I tried. Mid-mornings were for study, not mindless scrolling, not endless news owls filled with fear and noise. Instead, I fed my mind intentionally, rereading old Stoic writings, studying biographies of men and women who had built empires of character before they built anything else. Instead of chasing quick dopamine hits, I sought out wisdom like a starving man hunting for real food. And slowly, very slowly, the cravings for validation, attention, and empty victories began to fade. They didn't disappear, but they stopped ruling me. When the opportunity with the fintech startup finally came into focus, I approached it with a discipline I had never possessed before. I didn't jump at the first shiny offer. I didn't chase titles or big promises. Instead, I asked hard questions. Not about money or fame or how fast we could scale, but about integrity, purpose, values. If the answers didn't match the vision I was building inside my own mind, I walked away, no matter how tempting the deal. One afternoon, not long after I'd started consulting for the company, I sat across from a potential investor in a coffee shop in Burlington. He was slick, well-dressed, wore a Rolex that probably cost more than my old Jeep. He made it clear he loved our mission statement, but only if we tweaked a few things to make it more marketable. Tone down the ethical transparency, pump up the hype, make it sexier for the headlines. My old self would have nodded along. Agreed, sold a version of myself that people wanted to buy, but the man I was becoming sat back, sipped his coffee, and smiled politely. "No, thank you," I said, simple, final. The investor leaned back, eyebrows raised like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. "You're passing on a 7-figure commitment," he said, incredulous. I nodded. "I'm passing on selling my soul." As I left the coffee shop, a biting wind whipped down the street, but inside I felt something warm, not pride, not arrogance, something deeper, a confirmation. I didn't need a golden crown, a flashy announcement, or the applause of strangers. I was wearing a crown no one could see, an invisible crown, heavy with integrity, steady with conviction. And for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't need the world to recognize it. I just needed to live it. That night, sitting by the fire, I thought back to all the times I'd compromised. All the times I traded a piece of myself for applause, approval, status. Each trade had felt small at the time, insignificant, but they had added up. Each one a crack in the foundation, each one a loose stone in the walls of my mind, until the whole structure collapsed. Now every decision to stay true, no matter how small, was like setting a new stone in place, solid, deliberate, permanent. I wish I could tell you that the temptations stopped coming after that. They didn't. If anything, success started to sniff around again. Investors, media outlets, even influencers offering to amplify our story for the right price. But I wasn't building a brand this time. I was building a citadel. And anything that threatened the integrity of that citadel was turned away at the gates. I also wish I could tell you I never felt doubt again, but that's not how it works. Every day, the fear still whispered, "Play it safe, fit in, don't risk being misunderstood." And every day I whispered back, "No, not anymore." Each refusal wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, but it was stronger than any shout. Walking through town, I started to notice something strange. People treated me differently. Not because of what I wore. My boots were still scuffed, my jacket still secondhand. Not because of what I drove. My battered old Tesla made it obvious I wasn't chasing flash anymore. It was something else, something they could feel. I carried myself differently. Not with arrogance, not with loudness, but with quiet certainty. A presence built not on titles or bank accounts, but on the invisible architecture of a disciplined mind. A few weeks later, one of my colleagues pulled me aside. He said, "There's something about you, Jack. When you walk into a room, people straighten up. It's like, I don't know, you don't have to say anything, you just lead." I smiled. Not because I needed the compliment, but because I knew he wasn't really seeing me, he was seeing the crown. The invisible crown built on thousands of invisible choices, the crown I forged through failure, isolation, discipline, and unrelenting honesty. The crown no one could give me and no one could take away. I wasn't finished, and I knew that. The walls of the citadel still needed strengthening. The battles would keep coming, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't pretending to be strong. I was strong, not because I conquered the world, but because I conquered myself. And every single day, every single choice, I was reforging the crown. One stone, one breath, one unshakable decision at a time. The first real test came sooner than I expected. It wasn't some grand betrayal. It wasn't a catastrophic event. It was smaller, more ordinary. A whisper from the past carried by an unexpected visitor. It happened one afternoon as I was finishing a quiet meeting at the new fintech office. A man approached me in the lobby, someone I hadn't seen since the days when headlines still printed my name. Like a badge of shame, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Jack," he said, "there's an opportunity you should hear about." Old reflexes stirred inside me, the ones that craved validation, that itched for easy redemption, but I stayed still. I listened, and what he offered was everything I had once wanted: fast growth, media attention, the chance to be a headline again. The catch: it meant partnering with some of the very people who had watched me fall and done nothing. People whose loyalty shifted with the wind, people who valued flash over substance. For a moment, I felt the old hunger rise, the part of me that wanted to scream to the world, "I'm back." But then I remembered who I was now. I remembered the cold mornings, the brutal reflections, the silent battles fought in the empty cabin. I remembered the vow, "Guard your gates." And I smiled, a real smile this time. "Thanks," I said, but no thanks. No anger, no bitterness, just calm certainty. The man blinked, confused. He didn't understand. He couldn't see the fortress behind my eyes, but I could feel it stronger than ever. As winter deepened, I found my rhythm. I worked with focus, not frenzy. I spoke with intention, not urgency. Every day I lived by the same quiet question: does this strengthen me or weaken me? Not just in work, in conversations, in habits, in thoughts, and with every choice rooted in principle instead of impulse, the citadel grew stronger, stone by stone, breath by breath. It wasn't that the world changed. The storms still came. Unexpected crises, frustrations, moments of loneliness that snuck up and wrapped around me like the bitter Vermont wind. But I no longer met them with panic. I met them with patience, a steady hand on the wheel, a mind that didn't yield at the first crack of thunder, a heart that stayed anchored even when the ground shook. There was a night a few months later that I'll never forget. A blizzard rolled through Vermont, the kind locals called a once-in-a-decade storm. Snow piled against the cabin windows. Winds howled like wild animals. The power flickered, then went out completely. I pulled on my boots and coat, lit a single lantern, and stepped outside. The world was chaos. Trees bent under the weight of the snow. The sky churned with furious clouds. The wind tore at me, freezing, relentless. But I stood there alone on the hill and smiled, because inside where it mattered, I was untouched. I could feel the storm raging against the walls of my mind, searching for cracks, for weaknesses, and it found none. I raised my face to the blizzard and whispered, not in defiance, but in reverence, "I am the citadel." Not because I was stronger than the storm, but because I no longer needed the storm to be gentle, to stand tall. My strength was not dependent on mercy. It was forged through fire, shaped by failure, hardened by 1,000 invisible battles fought and won. After a while, I turned back toward the cabin. Inside, the fire had dimmed, but it still burned steady, patient, alive. Like me, I stoked the flames carefully, methodically, not rushing, not panicking, because I understood now. A strong life isn't built in bursts of passion. It's built in slow, deliberate acts of discipline, stacked quietly over time, day after day, choice after choice, battle after battle. Until one day you realize that no matter what chaos the world throws your way, you are unmoved. Weeks turned into months. Spring crept in, soft and slow, melting the fields, breathing life back into the trees. The town changed around me. New shops opening, new faces passing by. But I stayed steady, quietly building, quietly leading, quietly living. Not for applause, not for headlines, but for the man I faced in the mirror each morning. A man I could finally respect. A man who wore an invisible crown heavier and more precious than any trophy or title. One evening, my sister called from Boston. She asked how I was doing, and for the first time in years, I answered without hesitation, I'm good. Not perfect, not finished, but good. Whole-rooted alive. Later that night, sitting by the fire, I thought about all the bedtime stories we tell ourselves when we're young. Stories where heroes slay dragons and kingdoms are won with a single battle. But real life isn't a single battle. It's a siege. It's years of standing watch at the gates of your own mind. It's thousands of small victories unseen, uncelebrated, that build a fortress no one can breach. And maybe in the end, that's the truest kind of sovereignty. Not ruling others, not commanding armies, but commanding yourself, living each day with intention, integrity, and unwavering strength. Building your mind into a citadel so strong, so deeply rooted that no storm, no betrayal, no failure can tear it down. I'm not the same man who stood on a San Francisco rooftop years ago, drunk on success, blind to the cracks beneath my feet. I'm something better, something real, something unshakable. And as long as I keep tending the fire, guarding the gates, and reforging the crown, the citadel will stand, always.